Ethan Carter sat on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking under his weight. The small room he shared with his 10-year-old sister, Lily, was dimly lit by the pale glow of a single bulb. Peeling wallpaper curled at the corners, and a chill seeped through the cracks in the old wooden floorboards. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets of their run-down neighborhood, carrying the faint hum of passing cars and distant voices. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the hands inching closer to midnight. On the small desk across the room, a stack of unfinished homework waited for him, but exhaustion held him back. His day had been long: school, followed by a shift at the local grocery store, and then helping Lily with her math homework. "Ethan," came Lily's soft voice. She was curled up under a thin blanket, her wide brown eyes peeking out. "Did Mom text you?" Ethan's chest tightened. Their mother, Melanie, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, often coming home long after they'd gone to bed. He glanced at his phone and shook his head. "Not yet, Lil. She's probably busy. Go to sleep, okay?" Lily hesitated but nodded, her face full of trust. "You'll stay here, right? Until I fall asleep?" "Always," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. As Lily's breathing slowed and she drifted off, Ethan leaned back against the wall, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind raced with worries. The overdue rent, the empty fridge, the worn-out soles of his sneakers. He wanted to do more for his family, but felt trapped by their circumstances. Every day felt like a battle he couldn't win. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. He pulled on his threadbare jacket and kissed Lily's forehead before heading out. The streets were slick, puddles forming in every crack and pothole. Ethan kept his head down as he walked to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The day dragged on. At lunch, he sat alone, staring at the plain sandwich he'd packed, a single slice of cheese between 2 pieces of dry bread. Around him, groups of students laughed and chatted, their voices blending into a dull roar. Ethan didn't belong in their world, and he'd stopped trying to fit in long ago. After school, he hurried to his part-time job, stocking shelves at a local grocery store. The pay was meager, but it was something. As he worked, he overheard customers complaining about trivial inconveniences, their voices sharp with entitlement. It made his blood boil. Did they even realize how lucky they were? By the time his shift ended, the rain had turned into a downpour. Ethan pulled his hood up and started the long walk home. The streets were nearly empty, the sound of water splashing under his worn sneakers the only companion. As he turned a corner, he saw an elderly man struggling to get up from the sidewalk. His cane had slipped on the wet pavement, and groceries were scattered around him. Without thinking, Ethan ran over. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked, crouching down. The man looked up, rain dripping from his gray hair. His face was lined with age, but his eyes held a sharpness that hadn't faded. "I'll be fine, just lost my balance," he said, though his voice wavered. Ethan helped him to his feet, steadying him with one hand while gathering the groceries with the other. "Let me carry these for you," he offered. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, son. My name's Walter, by the way." "I'm Ethan," he replied, hoisting the bags and walking beside Walter to a nearby building. The apartment complex was modest, but better maintained than the houses in Ethan's neighborhood. When they reached Walter's door, the older man smiled. "You've got a good heart, Ethan. Not many kids these days would stop to help an old man." Ethan shrugged, feeling a bit awkward. "It's nothing. Just glad I could help." Walter's eyes lingered on him, as if seeing something deeper. Sometimes the smallest acts mean the most. Ethan nodded, unsure of how to respond. He said goodbye and walked back into the rain, unaware of how much that simple act of kindness would soon change his life. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan woke the next morning, replaced by a pale gray sky stretching over his small town. It was Saturday, a rare day off from school, but not from responsibilities. Ethan shuffled to the kitchen, his socks sliding against the cold linoleum floor. The cupboards were nearly bare, and he frowned, piecing together a simple breakfast of toast and peanut butter for Lily. "Morning, Lil," he said, setting the plate in front of her as she sat at their wobbly kitchen table. "Thanks, Ethan," Lily said, her face lighting up with her usual toothy grin. "Are we doing anything fun today?" Ethan forced a smile. Fun wasn't in their budget. "Maybe we'll play cards later," he offered. "I've got to run a few errands first." As he pulled on his jacket, he heard the faint rumble of an engine outside. Ethan frowned and moved to the window. Parked at the curb was a sleek black car, its glossy exterior starkly out of place in their worn neighborhood. Before he could make sense of it, the driver's side door opened, and a tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped out. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and he carried an air of authority that made Ethan instinctively straighten. The man approached their front door and knocked firmly. Ethan opened it, cautious but curious. "Good morning," the man said with a polite smile. "Are you Ethan Carter?" Ethan nodded, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" "I'm David Grayson," the man said, extending a hand. "My grandfather, Walter, told me about you." Ethan's mind raced back to the elderly man he'd helped in the rain. "Oh," he said, shaking David's hand. "Is he okay?" David's smile widened. "He's more than okay." He couldn't stop talking about the young man who went out of his way to help him. "He said you carried his groceries and made sure he got home safely." Ethan shrugged, feeling self-conscious. "It wasn't a big deal. Anyone would have done it." David raised an eyebrow. "I think you'd be surprised. Anyway, I came here because my grandfather asked me to thank you in person. And," he paused, pulling out a business card, "to offer you an opportunity." Ethan blinked, staring at the card in David's outstretched hand. "An opportunity?" "I run a small business downtown," David explained. "We specialize in community services, tutoring programs, local outreach, that kind of thing. We're always looking for hard-working, reliable young people to join our team part-time. My grandfather seems to think you'd be a perfect fit." Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. A job offer? It sounded too good to be true. He glanced back at Lily, who was watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. I don't know," Ethan said slowly. "I already have a job." David nodded. "I understand, but this could be more than just a paycheck. We offer mentorship, skill building, and flexibility for students. Think about it. My number's on the card." He tucked the card into Ethan's hand. "Whatever you decide, thank you for helping my grandfather. It meant a lot to him, and to me." With that, David gave a polite nod and walked back to his car. Ethan stood in the doorway, staring at the card, his thoughts a whirlwind. Baldy dust cheese later that day, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, turning the business card over in his fingers. Grayson Community Services was printed in sleek, professional letters, followed by David's name and phone number. "You should call him," Lily said, her voice small but insistent. Ethan looked over at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, doodling in her notebook. "It's not that simple, Lil. I already have a job." "But this one sounds better," she said, tilting her head. "He said they help people, right? And you're always helping me. You'd be really good at it." Ethan smiled faintly. Lily's faith in him was unshakable, even when he doubted himself. "I'll think about it." The next morning, Ethan found himself walking downtown, the business card in his pocket. The building was easy to spot, modern but welcoming, with large windows and a sign that read, "Grayson Community Center." He hesitated at the door, suddenly overwhelmed by nerves. The idea of working somewhere new, meeting new people, and possibly failing filled him with unease. But then he thought of Lily's hopeful expression, of her quiet belief that he could do anything. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The lobby was bright and bustling, with people of all ages moving about. A friendly receptionist greeted him. "Hi there. How can I help you?" "I'm here to see David Grayson," Ethan said, his voice wavering slightly. "Of course. One moment." She picked up the phone and spoke briefly before smiling at him. "He'll be right out." A few minutes later, David appeared, looking as polished as ever, but with a warm smile that eased some of Ethan's tension. "Ethan," he said, extending a hand, "I'm glad you came." "Thanks for meeting me," Ethan said, shaking his hand. "I wanted to learn more about the job." David led him to a small office and explained the role, helping organize after-school programs, assisting with tutoring sessions, and occasionally working with local charities. The pay was modest but better than what Ethan made at the grocery store. More importantly, the hours were flexible, leaving time for school and family. "It's a lot to take in," David said after finishing his explanation. "But I think you'd be great at it. You've already shown you're willing to step up for others." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling on him. "Can I think about it for a day or two?" "Take all the time you need," David said. "No pressure." As Ethan left the center, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel quite so bleak. Ethan paced the cramped living room, the faded carpet soft beneath his socked feet. In one hand, he clutched the business card David Grayson had given him, its sleek lettering now slightly smudged from his fingers. Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, watching him with an expectant look. "So?" she asked, her voice light but insistent. "Are you going to do it?" Ethan stopped mid-step and looked at her. "I don't know, Lil. It's a big change. What if I mess it up? What if it's too much?" Lily rolled her eyes in the exaggerated way only a 10-year-old could. "You won't mess up. You're Ethan. You're my superhero, remember?" He smiled despite himself. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" she pressed. "You said the grocery store doesn't pay much, and this sounds like it could be fun. You never get to do anything fun." Ethan sat down heavily on the armrest of the couch. Lily was right. Working at the grocery store was a grind, and it wasn't getting them anywhere. The opportunity at Grayson Community Center felt like a door cracking open, but stepping through it meant facing something new, something uncertain. Finally, he sighed. "All right, I'll call him." Lily grinned and gave him a thumbs up. "Told you so." The next day, Ethan stood outside the Grayson Community Center, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the building's modern facade. His nerves buzzed like static electricity, but he pushed the feeling aside and stepped through the glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, yet welcoming. Kids laughed in a nearby classroom, while adults chatted in the common area. Ethan approached the front desk, where the receptionist from before greeted him with a smile. "Ethan Carter, right?" she said, already picking up the phone. "David mentioned you might come by. He'll be out in just a moment." Ethan nodded, feeling his palms sweat as he waited. A minute later, David Grayson appeared, his polished demeanor as approachable as ever. "Ethan," he said warmly, extending a hand. "I'm glad to see you again." "Thanks," Ethan replied, shaking his hand. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'd like to give it a try." David's smile widened. "That's great to hear. Let me show you around." As they walked through the center, David explained the organization's mission: to support the community through education, outreach, and mentorship programs. Ethan saw classrooms filled with kids practicing math problems, a gymnasium where teens played basketball, and a quiet study area where volunteers tutored students. "We focus on helping young people find their strengths," David said, as they passed a group of high schoolers working on a group project. "Whether it's through academics, sports, or just giving them a safe space to grow." Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of inspiration. He thought about Lily and how much she'd thrive in a place like this. For the first time, he felt like he could be part of something meaningful. David led him to a small office and handed him a folder. Here's the onboarding paperwork. Take your time filling it out, and if you have any questions, just ask. You'll start shadowing one of our team leaders tomorrow. Team leader? Ethan asked, his nerves spiking. Don't worry, David said with a chuckle. You won't be thrown into the deep end. We'll ease you into it. Ethan nodded, clutching the folder like a lifeline. The next afternoon, Ethan returned to the center for his first shift. He was paired with Sophia, a cheerful college student who radiated warmth and confidence. She walked him through the basics of his role, from organizing after-school activities to helping younger kids with homework. Their first task was overseeing a group of middle schoolers in the art room. As Sophia handed out supplies, Ethan found himself drawn to a boy sitting alone, sketching quietly in the corner. Hey, Ethan said, crouching beside him. What are you working on? The boy hesitated, then held up his sketch pad. It was a detailed drawing of a treehouse, complete with a rope swing and a ladder. Wow, Ethan said, genuinely impressed. That's amazing. You're really talented. The boy's face lit up, a shy smile spreading across his lips. Thanks, he mumbled. Sophia noticed the interaction and gave Ethan an approving nod. You've got a knack for this, she said later. Connecting with the kids. Ethan shrugged, feeling a rare sense of pride. I get what it's like to feel like nobody notices you. Sophia didn't pry, but her expression softened. Well, you're definitely in the right place. By the end of the day, Ethan was exhausted but oddly fulfilled. He walked home under the setting sun, his steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. When he opened the front door, Lily ran to greet him, her face bright with curiosity. How was it? She asked eagerly. It was. Ethan paused, searching for the right word. Good. Really good, Lily beamed. See? I told you. As Ethan sat down to tell her about his day, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. For the first time, he could see a path forward, not just for himself, but for Lily and their mom too. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to take it one step at a time. Ethan's alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., pulling him from a restless sleep. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the cracked ceiling for a moment before throwing off the thin blanket and sitting up. Today marked his second week at the Grayson Community Center, and while he enjoyed the work, the growing responsibilities were already beginning to weigh on him. In the kitchen, he found Lily at the table, her head bent over a workbook. She was chewing on the end of her pencil, her brow furrowed in concentration. Morning, Lil, Ethan said, ruffling her hair as he passed by. Morning, she mumbled, barely looking up. Hey, can you help me with this math problem later? It's hard. Of course, Ethan replied, pouring himself a quick bowl of cereal. I'll be back by dinner, okay? Lily nodded, her trust in him unwavering. Ethan smiled faintly as he grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the run-down neighborhood. As he walked, he rehearsed his to-do list for the day. Help run a tutoring session, set up for the afternoon basketball league, and assist Sophia with a community outreach event. It was a lot, but Ethan was determined to prove himself. At the community center, the morning started smoothly. Ethan and Sophia set up chairs and tables for the tutoring session, arranging supplies for the kids who'd arrive shortly. As they worked, Sophia glanced at him. You're settling in pretty well, she said, her tone encouraging. Thanks, Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure he agreed. He still felt out of place sometimes, like he didn't belong in a world where people genuinely cared about each other's success. You know, Sophia added, it's okay to ask for help if you're feeling overwhelmed. No one expects you to do everything perfectly. Ethan nodded, though the words didn't fully sink in. Asking for help wasn't something he was used to. Later that day, Ethan found himself overseeing a group of middle schoolers in the gym. The basketball league had started, and his job was to keep the kids organized and encourage them during their drills. Most of the kids were lively and cooperative, but one boy, Jamal, stood out. He sat on the sidelines, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Hey, Jamal," Ethan said, walking over. "Why aren't you out there with the others?" Jamal shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I'm not good at this. I'll just mess up." Ethan crouched beside him, his voice quiet but firm. "You know, I used to think that way too, but messing up is how you get better. Everyone out there started from scratch." Jamal glanced at the court, his expression hesitant. "What if they laugh?" "Then you show them you're tougher than that," Ethan replied. "Come on, I'll shoot hoops with you for a bit." Reluctantly, Jamal joined Ethan on the court. They started with simple passes, then moved on to shooting. By the end of the hour, Jamal was smiling, the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack. "You've got a talent for this," Sophia said as she walked over. "He looks up to you, you know." Ethan shrugged, but her words stayed with him. As the day wound down, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment, but also exhaustion. He stayed late to help Sophia clean up after the outreach event, and by the time he got home, the sky was dark and his body ached. Inside, he found Lily asleep on the couch, her math workbook open beside her. Guilt pricked at him. He'd forgotten to help her. Quietly, he scooped her up and carried her to bed, tucking the blanket around her small frame. "I'm sorry, Lil," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll do better." The next day at the center, Ethan's exhaustion caught up with him. During the tutoring session, he forgot to print enough worksheets, leaving several kids idle. In the gym, he accidentally double-booked the space, causing confusion among the staff. By the afternoon, frustration bubbled over. David found him pacing in the break room, his fists clenched at his sides. "Ethan," David said gently, closing the door behind him. "Take a breath. What's going on?" Ethan stopped, his chest heaving. "I'm screwing up, that's what. I can't keep up with everything." David leaned against the counter, his expression calm. "You're taking on a lot, Ethan. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. But you don't have to do it alone." Ethan shook his head, his voice rising. "I'm not like the others here, David. I can't afford to mess up. I have my sister to think about, my mom. If I fail—" "You won't," David interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "But no one succeeds by carrying everything on their own shoulders. Let people help you. That's what we're here for." Ethan stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. He wanted to believe David, but it was hard to let go of the walls he'd built to protect himself. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, helping Lily with her math homework. Her laughter filled the small space as he made up silly mnemonics to help her remember formulas. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight on his chest lift slightly. As Lily finished the last problem, she looked up at him. "You're the best, Ethan." He smiled, ruffling her hair. "I don't know about that, Lil, but I'm trying." Over the next few days, Ethan started leaning on his co-workers more. He asked Sophia for advice when planning activities, and he accepted help from other volunteers when things got busy. Slowly but surely, he found a rhythm. The challenges didn't disappear, but they became manageable. One afternoon, as he walked home from the center, he realized something. He was learning to stand tall, not by carrying everything alone, but by trusting others to hold him up when he needed it. Ethan's days at the Grayson Community Center began to follow a steady rhythm. Each morning, he helped with tutoring sessions, encouraged kids during gym activities, and supported community events. His confidence grew with every task completed and every child who looked at him with admiration. Yet, as the weeks passed, a new emotion began to creep in. Pride, not the healthy kind, but the kind that whispered he needed to prove he could handle everything on his own. It started with small decisions. Ethan stopped asking Sophia for advice, feeling that he should be able to figure things out himself. He stayed late to complete tasks he could have delegated, insisting he didn't need help. At first, no one noticed, until things started slipping through the cracks. One chilly Thursday morning, Ethan arrived at the center early, determined to prepare for the day's events without relying on anyone. A local charity was hosting a food drive in the community center's gym, while the after-school basketball league still needed space. Juggling the logistics of both events was daunting, but Ethan was confident he could handle it. By noon, chaos erupted. The charity's volunteers had taken over the gym entirely, leaving the basketball team with nowhere to practice. Parents arrived, frustrated that their children were left waiting in the lobby. The team coach, Mr. Lang, approached Ethan, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "What's going on, Ethan?" Mr. Lang asked, crossing his arms. "We had the gym booked for today." Ethan swallowed hard, his face flushing. I thought the charity drive would wrap up by now," he stammered. Mr. Lang raised an eyebrow. "Did you confirm that with anyone?" Ethan's stomach sank. He hadn't. He'd been so eager to handle everything on his own that he hadn't bothered to double-check the schedule. David Grayson arrived a few minutes later, calmly diffusing the situation and finding a compromise. The basketball team used the outdoor court, while the charity drive continued inside. Ethan stood in the corner, his pride crushed, as David addressed the frustrated parents. Later that evening, David called Ethan into his office. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the overhead lights. Ethan sat across from David, his shoulders hunched. "Ethan," David began, his tone gentle but firm, "I know you're trying your best, but today was a mess, and it could have been avoided." "I know," Ethan mumbled, staring at his hands. I thought I could handle it." David leaned forward, his expression softening. "Why didn't you ask for help? You have a team here for a reason." Ethan hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he muttered, "Because I didn't want to look weak. I thought if I asked for help, people would think I wasn't good enough." David let the silence hang for a moment before replying. "Ethan, asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise. Nobody, no matter how skilled or hard-working, can do everything alone." Ethan nodded slowly, the truth of David's words settling uncomfortably in his chest. The next day, Ethan tried to shake off his lingering embarrassment and focus on his tasks, but his pride, bruised and fragile, made it difficult to open up. He avoided Sophia, feeling ashamed of how he'd ignored her advice. He kept his head down during meetings, afraid of drawing attention to himself. The camaraderie he'd begun to build with the team now felt out of reach. At home, Lily noticed the change. One evening, as Ethan helped her with her homework, she set her pencil down and studied him closely. "You're quiet," she said. "Did something bad happen?" Ethan forced a smile. "I'm fine, Lil. Just tired." Lily frowned, unconvinced. "You can tell me, you know. You always tell me to talk about stuff when I'm upset." Her words struck a chord, but Ethan only ruffled her hair. "I'll be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. A week later, Ethan faced another challenge. The center was hosting a career fair for high school students, and Ethan was tasked with coordinating the setup. Determined to redeem himself, he threw himself into the work, spending hours creating detailed schedules and diagrams. On the day of the event, Ethan arrived early, triple-checking every detail. But as the morning unfolded, small problems snowballed. A vendor arrived late, leaving one booth empty. A group of volunteers didn't show up, and the refreshments table ran out of water. Ethan rushed from one issue to the next, trying to fix everything on his own. By the afternoon, his frustration boiled over. When Sophia gently suggested asking other staff members for help, Ethan snapped, "I've got it under control," he barked, his tone sharper than he intended. Sophia's eyes widened in surprise, and Ethan immediately regretted his words. But before he could apologize, she walked away. Her expression hurt. The fair eventually ended, but Ethan didn't feel relief. He lingered in the empty gym, staring at the scattered chairs and crumpled flyers. His chest felt heavy with guilt and exhaustion. He thought about how he'd pushed everyone away. His team, Sophia, even Lily. And for what? Pride? Fear? As he sat there, lost in thought, the gym doors creaked open. Walter Grayson, David's grandfather, shuffled inside. "Mind if I sit?" Walter asked, motioning to the bench beside Ethan. Ethan nodded. Walter settled in, his cane resting against his knee. "David told me you've been having a rough time," he said matter-of-factly. "That true?" Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Yeah, I keep messing up, and every time I try to fix it, I just make it worse." Walter nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Ethan, when I was your age, I thought I had to do everything on my own. Didn't want anyone to see me struggle. But you know what I learned?" Ethan looked at him, curious despite himself. Walter smiled faintly. "The strongest people are the ones who know when to lean on others. Life's not a solo act, kid. It's a team sport." Ethan let the words sink in, the weight of his pride loosening slightly. "I don't want to let anyone down," he admitted. Walter chuckled. "Let me tell you something, Ethan. You're not letting anyone down by being human. Just be honest, with your team, with your family, and most importantly, with yourself." Ethan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thanks, Walter." The old man patted Ethan's shoulder. "Anytime, kid." That night, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Walter's words echoed in his mind, mingling with David's advice and Lily's quiet wisdom. He realized he'd been so focused on proving his worth that he'd lost sight of what truly mattered, the connections he'd made and the people who believed in him. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the center with a renewed sense of purpose. He sought out Sophia first, apologizing sincerely for his outburst. To his relief, she smiled and forgave him. "I get it," she said. "Just don't shut us out next time, okay?" "I won't," Ethan promised. As the day unfolded, Ethan began asking for help when he needed it, delegating tasks to his team, and trusting others to support him. The weight of his pride began to lift, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he didn't have to face everything alone. The late autumn air carried a sharp chill as Ethan hurried toward the Grayson Community Center, his breath forming faint clouds in the early morning light. He felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. The career fair debacle and his argument with Sophia were behind him, and things seemed to be improving. He was learning to rely on others, and for the first time, he felt like part of a team. Today was a big day. The center was hosting its annual community celebration, a massive event that brought together families, volunteers, and local businesses. Ethan had been given a key role, coordinating the youth activity booths. It was a daunting responsibility, but he felt ready. Bardag. The morning began smoothly. Ethan worked closely with the other volunteers, setting up tables, organizing supplies, and making sure every booth was ready for the influx of visitors. Families began arriving, their laughter and chatter filling the center with energy. Kids crowded the arts and crafts stations, while teens gravitated toward the basketball tournament in the gym. Ethan found Sophia near the face-painting booth, helping a group of kids. "Looks like everything's running smoothly," he said, smiling. She gave him a playful nudge. "You're doing great, boss, see? Told you it's easier when you don't try to do it all yourself." Ethan chuckled, feeling a swell of pride. For once, he didn't feel like an imposter. He felt like he belonged. Wow. But, as the afternoon wore on, small problems began to arise. The bounce house deflated when a generator malfunctioned, leading to a group of crying toddlers. A volunteer at the food booth called out sick, leaving a critical gap in staffing. Ethan jumped from one issue to the next, trying to patch things together as best he could. Then came the breaking point. At the sports equipment booth, a group of teens began arguing over a missing basketball. The shouting quickly escalated into a scuffle, drawing the attention of parents and staff. Ethan rushed over, his heart pounding. "Hey, break it up!" he shouted, stepping between the boys. One of the teens, a tall boy in a red hoodie, glared at Ethan. "It's his fault," he snapped, pointing at another boy. "He stole the ball." "I didn't steal anything," the other boy shot back, his face flushed with anger. Ethan raised his hands, trying to calm them down. "Let's all take a breath, all right? We'll figure this out." But before he could defuse the situation, the boy in the hoodie shoved the other, sending him stumbling into the table of sports equipment. The crash was loud, and suddenly all eyes were on Ethan. Panic surged through him. He felt everyone's expectations pressing down, waiting for him to fix the chaos. His throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words. "Stop it, both of you," he finally snapped, his voice shaking. "You're ruining the event for everyone." The words came out harsher than he intended, and the boys froze, their anger replaced by guilt. But the damage was done. Parents muttered among themselves, and Ethan could feel their judgment. One of the boys stormed off, slamming the door behind him. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving. He'd managed to end the fight, but at what cost? By the time the event wound down, Ethan felt like a failure. He stayed late to help clean up, avoiding everyone's eyes. Sophia approached him as he gathered stray paper cups from the floor. "Hey," she said softly, "you okay?" Ethan shook his head. "I messed up. I yelled at those kids in front of everyone. I didn't know what else to do." Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled a tough situation the best you could. No one's perfect, Ethan. And those kids, sometimes they need to see that we're human too." Her words were kind, but they didn't ease the knot in his chest. He thanked her quietly and left, the weight of his perceived failure dragging behind him. Bahur. At home, Ethan found Lily sitting at the kitchen table, drawing in her notebook. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up. "How was the celebration?" "It was fine," Ethan mumbled, dropping his bag by the door. Lily frowned. "You don't sound fine." Ethan sighed and sat across from her, resting his head in his hands. "I messed up today, Lil. I yelled at some kids and ruined everything." Lily tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Did you fix the fight?" "Yeah, but then you didn't ruin everything," she said matter-of-factly. "You tried your best, right?" Ethan looked at her, his heart aching at her unwavering faith in him. "Yeah, I guess," Lily smiled. "Then that's what matters. You always tell me that making mistakes is how we get better." Ethan couldn't help but chuckle softly. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that?" She grinned, her confidence in him giving him a glimmer of hope. The next day, Ethan arrived at the community center, unsure of what to expect. To his surprise, Walter Grayson was waiting for him in the lobby, his cane resting against the arm of his chair. "Morning, kid," Walter said, motioning for Ethan to sit beside him. "David told me about yesterday." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Great," he muttered. "Guess everyone knows I messed up." Walter chuckled. "Messing up's part of the job, kid. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Walter leaned forward, his eyes sharp but kind. "Life's full of fights, big and small. You can't control everything that happens, but you can control how you bounce back. You've got heart, Ethan. Don't let one bad day make you forget that." Ethan nodded slowly, Walter's words settling over him like a blanket. For the first time, he realized that his mistakes didn't define him. What mattered was what he did next. That afternoon, Ethan sought out the boys from the scuffle. He found them shooting hoops at the outdoor court, their earlier anger replaced by sheepishness. Hey, Ethan said, walking over. Can we talk? The boys glanced at each other, then nodded. I'm sorry for yelling at you yesterday, Ethan said. I shouldn't have lost my temper, but you've got to understand. This place is for everyone, and we can't let stuff like that ruin it. The boy in the red hoodie shuffled his feet. We're sorry, too. We didn't mean to make a scene. Ethan smiled faintly. Apology accepted. Now how about a rematch? I'll even ref. The boys grinned, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he was making real progress, not just with them, but with himself. That evening, as Ethan walked home, he felt lighter. The weight of his failure had lifted, replaced by a quiet determination. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew he could face them, one step at a time, just like Walter said. The brisk autumn wind tugged at Ethan's jacket as he walked to the Grayson Community Center. The sharp morning air seemed to echo the clarity he felt within himself after the challenges of the past weeks. Yesterday's apologies and Walter's wisdom had left a mark. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something new. Self-forgiveness. Today, he wasn't just going to show up. He was determined to step up, not only for the kids and the team, but for himself. The morning began with Ethan overseeing the tutoring sessions. A group of middle schoolers sat at small tables, scribbling notes and occasionally whispering to one another. Ethan walked around, checking on their progress. At one table, a shy girl named Mia stared at her math worksheet, her pencil hovering over the page. Hey, Mia, Ethan said gently, crouching beside her. Need some help? She nodded without looking up, her small voice barely audible. I don't get fractions. Ethan pulled up a chair. All right, let's break it down. Fractions are like slices of pizza. If you've got 4 slices and you eat one, how much is left? Mia's lips twitched into a smile. 3. Exactly. So if you eat 1 out of 4, what fraction is that? 1/4? She asked tentatively. Bingo, Ethan said, grinning. See? You're already getting it. As Mia's confidence grew, Ethan felt a surge of pride. Helping her reminded him of Lily, who'd struggled with similar problems. Maybe, just maybe, he was good at this. Later, during lunch, Ethan sat with Sophia and a few other volunteers. They laughed and shared stories about the day, the camaraderie filling the room with warmth. Ethan noticed how easily the others leaned on one another, how they worked together without hesitation. He thought back to the fight he'd mediated yesterday. He'd been so focused on resolving it alone that he hadn't considered asking someone else for input. It hit him then. Strength wasn't just about standing tall by yourself. It was about knowing when to lean on others. That afternoon, David approached Ethan in the gym. You've been doing great, Ethan, David said, his tone encouraging. I've got a new challenge for you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A challenge? David smiled. I'd like you to start mentoring Jamal. Ethan blinked. Me? A mentor? Yes, you, David replied, his voice firm but kind. Jamal's been coming out of his shell, but he needs someone to look up to, someone who understands what it's like to feel underestimated. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready for something so big. What if I mess it up? He asked. David placed a hand on his shoulder. You won't. You've already proven you have the heart for this. Just be yourself. The next day, Ethan met Jamal on the outdoor court. The boy, who had been so withdrawn just weeks earlier, now stood with a basketball tucked under his arm, his eyes bright with curiosity. You ready to practice? Ethan asked, tossing his own ball in the air. Jamal shrugged, but there was a flicker of excitement in his posture. I guess. They started with simple drills, passing, dribbling, and shooting. At first, Jamal struggled, his movements awkward and hesitant, but Ethan encouraged him, offering tips and cheering him on after every small victory. See, you're getting better already, Ethan said, after Jamal sunk a clean shot. Jamal grinned. You think I could make the team one day? Definitely, Ethan said without hesitation. But you've got to put in the work. Practice. Believe in yourself and don't give up, even when it's hard. Jamal nodded, his smile widening. For the first time, Ethan saw a spark of confidence in the boy's eyes. As the weeks passed, Ethan's bond with Jamal grew. They practiced on the court regularly, but their conversations extended beyond basketball. Jamal began opening up about school, his family, and his fears. Ethan listened, offering advice where he could and simply being present when words weren't enough. One afternoon, after a particularly tough practice, Jamal looked at Ethan and said, "You're like the coolest guy I know." Ethan chuckled. "I don't know about that, Jamal." "I mean it," Jamal insisted. "You actually care. Most people just don't." The words hit Ethan deeply. He realized that, in trying to help Jamal, he was also healing parts of himself. He'd spent so long feeling like he didn't matter, like his struggles were invisible. But now he saw the ripple effect of kindness, how one act could spark something bigger. At home, Ethan noticed a shift in Lily as well. Inspired by his stories about Jamal, she'd started helping her classmates with their own homework. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Lily looked up from her notebook and said, "You're doing a good job, Ethan." "Thanks, Lil," he said, ruffling her hair. "You're not too bad yourself." One Friday evening, David called a meeting with the staff and volunteers. As everyone gathered in the center's main hall, he stood at the front, his expression proud. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who's made a big impact over the past few weeks," David began. "This person stepped up during a tough time, built meaningful connections with the kids, and showed incredible growth." Ethan's stomach flipped as David's eyes landed on him. "Ethan Carter," David said with a smile. "Thank you for your hard work and dedication. You've shown us all what it means to rise above." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt his cheeks flush. As he stood, his coworkers clapped him on the back, their support overwhelming but welcome. Sophia leaned over and whispered, "Told you you're a natural." Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with pride, not the heavy, isolating pride he'd once carried, but the kind that came from knowing he was part of something bigger. That night, as Ethan walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he reflected on how far he'd come. The boy who'd once doubted his worth was now helping others find theirs. The challenges hadn't disappeared, but he was stronger now. Stronger because he'd learned to lean on his community, embrace his mistakes, and keep moving forward. The first snowfall of the season dusted the streets as Ethan made his way to the Grayson Community Center. The air was crisp and filled with the quiet anticipation of winter. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath visible in the icy air, and felt a warmth inside that had little to do with the cold. Today marked 6 months since he'd first walked into the center, unsure of himself and uncertain about his place in the world. Now he felt like a completely different person. Adolphe, on inside the center, the energy was electric. The annual winter showcase was happening, an event where kids, families, and volunteers celebrated the year's accomplishments. The gym was transformed into a festive wonderland, with twinkling lights strung across the rafters and tables piled high with baked goods. A stage stood at one end, where students would perform songs, skits, and speeches they'd worked on for weeks. Ethan walked through the bustling crowd, exchanging smiles and greetings. He saw Jamal shooting hoops with some friends, Mia helping at the arts and crafts table, and Sophia laughing with a group of parents. The sense of community was overwhelming, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. "Ethan," Jamal called, jogging over with a basketball under his arm. "Check this out." The boy performed a quick dribble and sank a perfect shot into the nearby hoop. Ethan clapped, grinning. "That was clean, Jamal. You've been practicing." "Yeah," Jamal said, his chest puffed with pride. "Thanks to you." Ethan tousled the boy's hair. "You did the work. I just showed you the way." As the showcase began, Ethan joined Sophia and Walter at a table near the stage. Walter had become a steady presence in Ethan's life, offering quiet encouragement and wise words whenever they were needed. Today, he wore a festive sweater and a satisfied expression. "You're looking good, kid," Walter said, nudging Ethan. "A lot more confident than when you first showed up here." Ethan chuckled. "I guess I've learned a thing or two." Walter's eyes twinkled. "That's the trick to life. You keep learning, no matter how old you get." The performances started, and Ethan watched with a full heart as the kids he'd worked with over the months shone on stage. Mia confidently recited a poem she'd written about overcoming challenges, her voice strong and clear. Jamal, along with a group of other boys, performed a skit that had the audience roaring with laughter. Ethan couldn't help but feel proud. These kids had come so far, and he'd been part of their journey. But more than that, they'd been part of his. After the showcase, David called Ethan aside. The crowd was thinning, and the center was beginning to quiet down. David smiled, his usual calm confidence radiating as he handed Ethan an envelope. "What's this?" Ethan asked, confused. "Open it," David said. Inside was a letter of recommendation for a scholarship to a local college, specifically for students who had demonstrated leadership and community service. Ethan's jaw dropped. "David, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll apply," David said with a grin. "You've earned this, Ethan. You've shown incredible growth, and I can't think of anyone more deserving." Tears stung Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." David clapped him on the shoulder. "You've done the hard work, Ethan. This is just the beginning." That evening, Ethan walked home with Lily, who was buzzing with excitement after the event. She'd won a small trophy for her artwork, and she couldn't stop talking about how much fun she'd had. "You're going to college, aren't you?" she asked suddenly, looking up at him. Ethan hesitated. "I don't know, Lil. It's a big step." "You have to," she said firmly. "You always tell me to believe in myself. Now it's your turn." Ethan smiled, her words warming him against the chill in the air. "All right, Lil, I'll try." The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the letter of recommendation in front of him. The sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the worn wood. He took a deep breath, pulled out an application form, and started filling it out. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future. It wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt. But now, he had something he hadn't had before, a sense of purpose and the knowledge that he wasn't alone. A few weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it, the words blurring together until he found the one that mattered. Congratulations. He was going to college. That night, Ethan sat on the porch, the crisp winter air biting at his cheeks. Lily joined him, wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew you'd do it," she said, leaning against him. Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "I couldn't have done it without you, Lil. Or the center, or Walter, or David, or Sophia. I guess it wasn't just me." Lily nodded. "That's what makes you strong." Ethan stared out at the quiet street, his heart full. He still had a long way to go, but he was ready for whatever came next. With his family, his community, and his newfound confidence, he knew he could face anything. The snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in a quiet promise of hope.